In a quiet valley surrounded by tall pine trees, there was a small wooden cabin that sat beside a winding river. Smoke rose gently from the chimney each evening, and warm light glowed through the cabin windows when the sun disappeared behind the hills. Near the cabin lived a dog named Bramble. Bramble was a sturdy brown dog with soft ears and watchful eyes. He lived with a kind old farmer who cared for the land, the animals, and the small garden beside the cabin. Every day, Bramble followed the farmer as he worked. He walked beside him in the fields, watched the chickens wander through the yard, and sometimes chased butterflies that floated over the grass. But when evening came and the sky grew dark, Bramble had a very special job. Inside the cabin, the farmer would build a warm fire in the stone fireplace. The flames crackled softly as they burned, filling the room with warmth and golden light. The farmer would sit in his wooden chair, sip a warm drink, and read quietly while Bramble curled up on the rug nearby. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, and the valley grew quiet. After a while, the farmer would grow sleepy. He would stand, stretch his tired arms, and say gently, "Time for bed, old friend." Then he would walk down the hallway, leaving the fire glowing softly in the fireplace. Before he left the room, he would always look at Bramble and say the same words, "Watch the fire." Bramble never barked or wagged his tail at those words. He simply lifted his head and looked carefully at the flames. He understood. Watching the fire was important. So while the farmer slept peacefully in his room, Bramble stayed awake beside the fireplace. The flames flickered and danced, glowing bright orange and gold. Sometimes they burned strong and tall. Sometimes they shrank down into quiet, glowing embers. Bramble watched them closely. The night outside was filled with sounds. Owls hooted softly from the trees. Crickets chirped in the grass. The wind whispered through the valley. But Bramble stayed right where he was, keeping his eyes on the fire. Many nights passed like this. Some nights were calm and peaceful. Other nights were stormy. Rain tapped against the cabin windows, and thunder rolled across the hills. Still, Bramble stayed awake, watching the fire. One cold evening in late autumn, the wind was stronger than usual. It pushed against the cabin walls and rattled the window frames. Inside, the fire burned brightly as the farmer finished his supper and sat down in his chair. "You've been a good helper today," he said to Bramble with a warm smile. Bramble wagged his tail softly. Soon the farmer grew sleepy, just as he always did. He stood up slowly and looked at the fire one last time. Then he turned to Bramble and spoke the familiar words. "Watch the fire." Bramble lifted his head and watched carefully as the farmer disappeared down the hallway. The cabin grew quiet again. The flames flickered and crackled gently. For a long time, nothing unusual happened. But as the wind outside grew stronger, one of the logs in the fireplace shifted suddenly. A small burning ember popped out and rolled onto the wooden floor. It glowed red, like a tiny star in the dark room. Bramble noticed it immediately. He stood up and walked closer. The ember rested quietly on the floor, but the rug nearby was dry and warm. If the ember stayed there too long, it could begin to burn. Bramble remembered the farmer's words. "Watch the fire." The dog lowered his nose carefully and blew a gentle breath toward the glowing ember. It rolled slightly, but still glowed, so Bramble nudged it carefully with his paw, pushing it closer to the stone edge of the fireplace where the floor was safe. The ember slowly faded until it turned dark and cool. Bramble watched it for a moment longer to make sure it was no longer glowing. Then he returned to the rug and sat quietly again. The fire continued to burn safely in the fireplace. Hours passed. The moon moved across the sky. The wind slowly grew calmer. Bramble stayed awake the entire night, watching the flames just as he had promised. Finally, morning light began to shine through the windows. Birds chirped outside, welcoming the new day. The farmer walked into the room, stretching his arms as he yawned. "Good morning, Bramble," he said cheerfully. Then he noticed something on the floor near the fireplace, a small black mark where the ember had rested during the night. The farmer looked at the fireplace, then at the mark on the floor, and finally at Bramble sitting calmly on the rug. Understanding slowly spread across his face. "You kept watch," he said softly. Bramble wagged his tail once. The farmer knelt beside him and gently scratched behind his ears. "You protected the cabin," he said with pride. Bramble leaned happily into the farmer's hand. He had only done what he was asked to do: watch the fire. From that day on, the farmer trusted Bramble even more than before, because sometimes the most important jobs are not loud or exciting. They do not need barking or running or chasing. Sometimes the most important job is simply staying awake, paying attention, and doing what you promised to do. And every night, when the fire glowed warmly in the stone fireplace, the farmer would smile at his faithful friend and say the same words: "Watch the fire." And Bramble, the dog who watched the fire all night, would quietly lift his head and keep his steady watch until morning.